And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's great to see everyone here. Thank you for joining us. We had a couple of interesting tech issues to get our day rolling, but it's all in a day, as they say. Hang on just a second. We, of course, are joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everyone.
It's great to see you. And it's already a huge crowd, which is fantastic because we have a totally crucial and unusual episode for you tonight, where I'm going to outline exactly how we actually had a presidential election that was a battle along the lines of what we've been discussing in terms of the UFO file and the mystery schools and this Masonic element that went to bat early on in the political cause with America and has kept on ever since. But in the way that it comes up here, and why I've termed the episode President X, is actually quite interesting, because it was going to be one kind of ex-president or another kind of ex-president. But each one of them, whether it was Henry Wallace or if it was going to be Harry Truman, we were going to get somebody who was going to have that X. And he's the kind of the first president who's going to be able to exercise that power station. And so that's what makes this so very crucial. I'm very glad on the feedback from the first, the closeout of the first 10 episodes, which was a two-parter last Friday and Saturday that we did. And this was exceptional because what happened was we had so much information that we couldn't condense it just into that Friday episode. So we did Friday and Saturday night. And that ended the first 10 episodes. And now we are on that streak of doing another 10. And so, this is something definitely for us to watch. And speaking of watch, Olivia, I left my watch right there. Can you get that for me? Because I'm going to need to keep time. No, it's in there. It's in there.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And one of the things I think that we do, gracias, señorita. One of the things I think that we do is we're going to take a look at who exactly the players were on the political side, and how the way that they relate to the X reporting that we've had going on is going to shock everyone here, as I know it shocked me, and I've been working on it for a while. But it's such a breakthrough that we instantly start off the second wave of 10 episodes with a complete history-changing breakthrough. And I don't say that lightly, given the kind of work that I do. It's the sort of thing that you hold back and sort of weigh things out. Well, let me tell you, we have such incredible information tonight that is going to blow apart any notion of our presidential history and the history of our political situation and who is pulling the strings and how it relates to this X technology, to this X effect, which I've termed apophium, and I'll get into why I've termed it that. But basically, what I can say coming out of those episodes is that, we came through understanding what the X was, who was involved, and how it was organized in our modern era around the UFO file. However, when you go a little further back, it starts to get organized around this idea of mystery airships way, way back in Atlantean times. And then it just shows up in mystery schools in stranger and stranger circumstances. So it's referring to something. And what we found over and over again for people who haven't seen the X shows is that it's a kind of steganography that's going on. And the way that the steganography works is these X's show up in plain sight whenever they're referring to this particular effect, to this particular technology. In modern times, we would call it. Although, you'd have to say something like, say, the Egyptians and embalming has an X characteristic to it. So I guess that's a kind of technology, just to get us all on the same page, to give us kind of an idea out there. So to start off now, in the second half of the program, we're going to take questions. And Olivia takes them all in caps. That way she knows exactly what to look for, because the questions go fast and furious when you have so many people. And tonight's theme of President X is someone who was going to be president in 1945. And things changed, as the deep state will do. But we're going to find out that the deep state is a symptom of this war between the mystery schools and these other darker elements, which in the last show we called Ahrimanic influences. And those Ahrimanic influences can move through organizations, and at times they can move through secret organizations quite easily, even if the organization is set up around an entirely different apparatus. And that's what I can point to specific events that has happened with certain hidden groups. And it certainly happened with the Masonic groups. So we're going to get into all that and what it's all about. But I want to start off tonight with a crucial photo. And I'm going to explain exactly how the research that we've done up to now around Tesla's work, around Trump's uncle's involvement, John G. Trump, with the MIT Rad Lab, with Vannevar Bush, who, of course, is well known in UFO circles as the person who was managing the UFO file. And there's a documented trail for him as well. When we get into it and look at it this way, that whole picture back there starts to make sense. But then when we start to pull it forward and we start to see Trump's involvement with his uncle, and we start to see some of the things going on now relating to the UFO file, we start to get a picture that this is all one big connected line. And if we get a handle on the line, then we get a really good handle on our history and what's happening now and the situation here on planet Earth. And Catherine Austin Fitz, who is a regular on the program, often says the key thing that we want to find out is who are the real forces that are running the Earth and why are they acting the way that they are. And that's kind of our jump off point for tonight. And of course, Olivia, if about midway before we get to the actual questions, if anything important comes up question-wise, you can shoot it my way.
You bet.
Well. And I saw that we had Dr. Joseph Farrell out there. I don't know if he's still out there, but hello, Joseph. I'm sure we're going to get you back on the program. I know you've been so busy finishing up this new mystery book, which I have no idea what it is, but over and over again, I have a few hints and I have some idea maybe what's happening. But we're very excited to have you out there, and I look forward to having you back on and just catching up. So here's the picture. Let's start with this. And this is the swearing-in ceremony of the 33rd President of the United States, Harry S. Truman. Of course, the S wasn't there yet in this picture, and I'll explain that. But oddly enough, two interesting characters show up in this picture. Over here is Henry Wallace. And over here is James Forrestal, who became the first Secretary of Defense. These are two crucial people, but I want you to look at their expression a little bit to get some idea. I know there's many people in the photo, but there's something kind of different about their expression. And I'm going to come back to it because it says everything about what we're going to find out tonight. Now, they're coming off of course, this incredible victory and the New Deal and FDR coming in after the Depression. And that is actually FDR during his inauguration. And he's really coming in and changing things. He'll be a 4-term president. And, we don't have 4-term presidents. As a matter of fact, because he did that and broke the mold, it turns out that they adopted a rule right after that said you can't have any more than 2. And that's why we're stuck with these guys for 8 years now instead of the 4 terms that FDR got. So Henry Wallace was somebody who was close to FDR. And FDR had a feeling with him. He didn't have a lot of experience, actually, but he had been the editor of a newspaper. His dad had been the Secretary of Agriculture, and he hailed from Iowa. But he was a very dynamic guy, and they got along incredibly well. Here's a picture after Wallace became his vice president. And I think there's kind of that good interaction. We get a hint of what's going on there with FDR and Wallace. It's certainly true that Wallace becomes the major cause person. His cause is the American people. He wants a minimum wage. He wants farmers to be organized. He wants, health benefits for Americans. He's very publicly minded, and he's an incredible sort of early version of what we'll get later with the Great Society. But he's a New Dealer, and if anything, FDR saw him as his successor right away. But they wanted to give him a little bit of experience, first of all, so they made him, like his dad, the Secretary of Agriculture. And in fact, he adopted farming practices that protected farmers, and it's kind of incredible, created this whole boomerang effect, slingshot effect coming out of the Depression, and really rebuilt that whole farming sector. So did some extraordinary things. But what was fascinating is by the time we get to 1940, Roosevelt really has it in mind now that he's going in for his third term, and he's saying, this is somebody who I really can trust, and this is somebody who's my natural successor. We see eye to eye, and this is going to include from a spiritual vantage point also, because spiritually FDR had a lot to offer that we don't hear about very often, and we're going to get into that tonight as well. I have so much show and tell because we're going to go through tonight with pictures, and I'm just going to keep pointing out the key players until we can kind of get a real feel for what was happening there, because the showdown that happens afterwards when FDR is out and Wallace and Truman are going to be president is the battle of the mystery schools that we've been kind of building up all the way through here, and it involves Theosophy and Anthroposophy and these deep Masonic lodges and these Ahriman and Ahrimanic forces. And it is such a clash of 20th century politics, ancient mystery schools, hidden aspects, and this X factor. And the key part is that to just think of it as, oh, somebody in there had some advanced technology and they were trying to hide it, doesn't capture it. The thing that they're protecting, the X factor, as it were, is more than just technology. It has the effect of transforming reality, and that is really what the issue is. If it was only straight up aliens visiting, this wouldn't be required. This is after they win in 1940. That is now FDR with his new vice president, who was Secretary of Agriculture, who became friends and really rose up from nowhere in Iowa and became a heartbeat away from the presidency. And I think that the pictures of these guys together really show that camaraderie that they had. Everyone said they got along great. And this is their original poster when they ran. That is FDR and Henry Wallace. And they were amazingly successful that year. There were a lot of voices saying, we need to stay out of World War II. There's a lot of isolationist voices going on at the time. There was also, we're sick of FDR, let's move on. And there are a lot of Republican agitation going on at the time, saying that FDR was too soft and that we needed to go over there and beat the hell out of Hitler and all this stuff. And in fact, FDR got the message and sort of played along, being sort of in that isolationist pose, and said, oh, I have no interest in going into that war in Europe. Don't worry about it. We did that in World War I. Didn't work out so well. And so on. Now, interestingly enough, as he rose through the ranks, Wallace had unusual enemies in terms of their intensity and in terms of the media and in terms of the early developments of things that would become like the Council on Foreign Relations, for example. It seems like the establishment really despised him, but Roosevelt had reached out and brought him in. And he was quite a visionary, and he had a remarkable mind. And the first thing that he did when he got in office was he developed this incredible relationship with Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush is very familiar in these X reports as the man who was definitely in charge of the UFO file. And, that's documented now. It goes beyond just the MJ-12 references. We've shown the Canadian officials who talked about how Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO file, and how physicist Robert Saubacher, in a letter in 1984 that we showed on this program, stated that he worked on this exotic UFO technology, in that it was Vannevar Bush who was in charge of it. So that's the end of that. There's no speculation there. We know. But Vannevar Bush when he was running the Rad Lab at MIT, he had some very interesting people in his secrecy circle as they were doing all this classified work. One of them was this gentleman, who is Trump's uncle, John G. Trump, Professor Trump. And Professor Trump at MIT was doing some extraordinary work, just incredible work. And he was working with Vannevar Bush. In fact, Vannevar Bush was his major protege, which is quite fascinating because we also know about our friend Professor Trump, that he was the one that the FBI called in to go through Tesla's records. And I'm going to read his actual transcript later of what they asked him to do exactly. And although we touched on it in Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule, which is one of the X episodes, I'm going to go a little deeper into who the connections are now because the picture is getting much wider. But first, I want to point this out. This is something that Olivia and I tracked down and actually spent some time at MIT going over. And it's quite fascinating because John G. Trump's papers are still there. And in fact, there's a hint as to his role in all of this. And it's right here where it says, if you can read that, it is box X is where all of John G. Trump's papers are stored. And if you couldn't get any more perfect than that in terms of what we're looking for with the X Steganography, well, John G. Trump's papers there at MIT are listed in their official MIT library in box X. Not that I expect there to be some paper in there that says, hey, here's the UFO blueprint. And for the stuff that I've looked at in depth coming out of that file, it looks very much like the work you might expect Trump was doing. Very deep stuff on X-rays and X-ray application in space. Okay, so it gets very interesting and ties back in with what we were going into with these two gentlemen who we introduced a couple of shows ago, who are called the Varian Brothers. The Varian Brothers are kind of the mavericks, really, of Silicon Valley. They're the ones who created this entire tech drive there in the 40s and 50s. But the thing that they created was something called the Klystron. And long story short, the Klystron is basically a microwave technology that allowed us to develop incredible radar to see low-flying planes, kamikazes in the Pacific Theater, and also gave us radar capabilities that just didn't exist at the time. And they are credited with helping us win World War II because we had such superior radar. But it went further than that because you might hear so much about these programs now like CERN and the particle accelerators and particle smashers. Well, that's all based on the Klystron. And as a matter of fact, they developed the first atom smasher. And we were looking earlier at a 1939 ad for this atom smasher that they were promoting. And we're going to find at the very heart of the X technology are the Varian Brothers and the work that they did. But very interestingly, as we've covered on this program, the Theosophical Society had technology at the turn of the century, 1800s into 1900s. And that technology was John Keely's technology. He was a contemporary of Nikola Tesla. And what happened is basically the society got behind it to a point where Blavatsky got concerned and wrote about it, saying that, he not only was he kind of tapping into this incredible occult secret, but that forces on the corporate side were going to try to raid it to use it, for their own purposes against the population. But on the other side, the mystery schools were really going to freak because he was putting this stuff out. So she kind of foresaw his bizarre ending in a way. And what happens is in the late 1890s, he demonstrates for the military an airship that, according to someone who was there, could go 500 miles per hour then. And the interesting stuff that he was developing goes right into that Nikola Tesla, into that, Tesla coil, wireless energy, the whole thing, it's there. But he adds this interesting element, which is this sympathetic etheric element, saying that basically you're using your psychic abilities when using this technology. So that he was kind of moving into this direction where the human being gets integrated into the action of this ethereal machine. And it's not this cold mechanistic technology. It is the warm, etheric heartbeat of the technology. So it was absolutely radical and revolutionary. Now, one of the things I was able to do was secure so many news reports from that period of time at the end, when they tried to discredit Keely's technology, when he died, and then his technology disappeared. And one of the things that I traced was that, I always like showing this because it gives us a real idea of what's happening here. What is this, Annie Besant? And Annie was the head of the Theosophical Society, handpicked by H.P. Blavatsky. And what happens with the Keely technology, long story short, to get us all caught up, is that there's so many threats to it that actually the corporate side, what they want to do, the early robber baron types, is they want to take the technology, discredit it in public, and work on it privately to come up with their own thing and dominate the market. And on the other side, there's strange esoteric elements that don't want this out because it's too early. So there's a battle going on there. And what happens is this. Keely dies unexpectedly. And his business partner gets into a situation where he's left with all this technology, and he's on the run, kind of, because these newspapers have taken out articles and they've said, well, Keely's technology, you know, really what was happening was they were using this kind of fraudulent thing to defraud investors and blah, blah, blah. Of course, none of it was true, but it was making this guy look bad. So he panicked, and he goes down to the warehouse where the Keely stuff was stored in Jamaica Plain, which I can tell you is about 20 minutes from here. And he stores the technology in a warehouse, but he decides, you know what, this is a bad scene. What they're going to do is they're going to get me, and then somehow they're going to get this stuff. So what he does is he boxes it up. He calls the warehouse workers and he says, get over here. We're boxing it all up, and we're sending it to London, and don't ask to who. So they send it over to London, and through a theosophist, we discover that the technology was sent to Besant. Now, Besant gets it, and she realizes all the different things that have come up about Keely. They're very close to the Keely work, and she already has contacts with Keely. But the partner decides she's the one who can take care of the situation. And what she decides is, you know what, this technology is too advanced in the wrong hands. And what will happen is these people will start bombing the heck out of each other with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to vouchsafe it. We're going to have the culture, hopefully see the culture rise from the theosophical teachings, and then we're going to open up this X technology coming from Keely's work. And that's the course that they take at the time, which is why we arrive like we do into the 1940s with Henry Wallace and Harry Truman duking it out to see who's going to become President X. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that the people, one more quick thing about Besant is this, she's working here, and whenever they do these ceremonies, which are these congresses, you see these X's show up on their clothing, and it's part of the ceremony, although it's never really actually identified what it represents. It's just an interesting thing. Over here is Colonel Olcott, who founded the Theosophical Society, and he's going into trance there. And he founded it with Helena Blavatsky. But they're working hard to not only change the spiritual paradigm here on planet Earth, but they start working into that political situation. That's why figures like Gandhi get their training from Annie Besant. Her whole thing about home rule in India, home rule in Ireland, there's an incredible political effect with Besant's work. And we have to keep that in mind. This isn't all about, you know, ascended masters, and it's not all about meditation techniques. Theosophy really takes the football and runs it down the field. What they're trying to do is change the entire paradigm in a short period, because there's this idea that if they don't, they're basically going to be running head on into these situations like World War I, like World War II, which will set humanity back generations. So this is the nature of the situation when we get into looking at this stuff, that there's this background about this technology being handed off through these mystery schools, but there's a big political element to it. And one of the biggest political elements I found was that Mr. Henry Wallace was not only a theosophist, but he was from the Halcyon Temple that we've been spotlighting, which is where the Varians came from, and whose father, John Varian, founded the Halcyon Temple. Now, quickly, in California, in 1903, the Halcyon Temple was founded, and that's an intentional Theosophical Society. It's post the Blavatsky period, and right after William Judge, who was the next leader of Theosophy, died unexpectedly in his 40s. So what we have is a very interesting situation brewing, where someone takes over named Catherine Tingley in America, but Annie Besant becomes the leader everywhere else, like Australia and Europe. And Annie Besant is trying to tell those American groups, look, we all need to follow in the footsteps of what Blavatsky was doing, and this is what you guys are doing is totally different. And they're saying, well, you've gone in a more Eastern direction. In fact, we want to try this other stuff. So they're having quite a clash, and the American branch disowns the European branch that Besant runs. And Catherine Tingley takes over, but what happens is she's enormously unpopular, a leader, and these different groups splinter off. Now, one of the groups that splintered off, which was the Halcyon group, they were kind of utopian-minded. They wanted to start a community. They really wanted things to change, and they wanted to become that important thing. And what happens is Besant sees in them that they do have some of the qualities that she's looking for. So she says to them, look, go for it. I want you to do it. And she writes a letter to John Varian, who is the father of the two Varians that I showed you, who developed the Klystron. Always want to show these connections between theosophy and the scientific developments. This is what's so crucial about this series, is that we're starting to understand those mystery schools, not as a lark back there who were thinking philosophical pie in the sky fantasies. These people were operative on scientific levels, political levels, religious levels. They are changing the society. And, we have to, in order to get the real thrust of what's happening here, we have to get a feel for who they are and what they're up to. So before we go full on into Harry Truman and this kind of Masonic mystery school battle that took place, I want you to take a look at this. That is Harry Truman in his Masonic regalia. And he's the only president who was the 33rd Mason. And that's going to be crucial also, because whoever was going to get in, of course, Wallace was also a Mason, but they were both 32-degree Masons when they ran. But when he got in, he actually became a 33rd degree Mason because of the X factor, in my opinion. But he's the first president who became 33. Important as we go here. Now, one of the things I want us to consider also is that the other person who's going to come into play here, believe it or not, is John F. Kennedy, because that's Harry Truman there with him after he gets in as president. And John F. Kennedy is going to try to take back what is lost there when Truman wins in his battle to become vice president, then president. And in fact, Truman is trying to help him do it. And that's also going to be quite fascinating. But they both realize that there's a factor out there, this other group, which has reached in through the Masonic aspect, through industry, through the deep state, to control and contain this X Steganography, this X factor for themselves. And that includes and heavily involves the UFO file. There are, in fact, attempts on behalf of the Theosophical Society to get into these Masonic groups and to work together. And that's Annie Besant there with a group which is a mixed gender Mason group. And there are these attempts over and over again by Theosophy to say to the other mystery schools, we want to join with you, let us in. And that goes back to Blavatsky saying it to the American mystery schools when she got here. And that's something that we learned from Rudolf Steiner. And I covered that pretty heavily in the last episode, so I'm not going to do too much of that here. But what I will say is this. In essence, Blavatsky came to them and said, I want to join you. And they said, you're a woman, you can't. And she said, but I know everything that you know. I'm on the same line. All you have to do is initiate me. And if you don't do it, I'm going to go and join this Paris lodge mystery school. And then, you know, I know all your secrets, so that won't be good for you. And what happens in this kind of mystery school melee is they decide, you know what, she's very dangerous, as it turns out, and we're not going to let her in. But what we will do is, according to Steiner now, they put her in an occult imprisonment, which is when her vision is opened, because Blavatsky is very unusual in this case. Unlike people who are just kind of lightly intuitive or whatever, she's a true mystic, and she's in charge, and she's in touch with these higher forces. So what happens is they decide, look, what we need to do is let her have these images, let her have these visions, but we need to send in our picture. We're going to send our transmission over there, and she's going to start seeing something totally different and getting totally different impressions. And they work as a group to do this. And we find that Blavatsky has a lot of problems after that. She moves around. She goes to India, and she has problems in India. And it seems like she is under what we would call now just psychic attack. In fact, that's what Steiner termed it. So this goes back to the idea that Steiner said in 1840 there was a big push towards scientific materialism, and we were having problems because within 100 years we were going to just become a completely godless society, no spirituality, nothing, just made for the machine. And they realized it. And so half of those groups said we're going to let a lot of things out to the public that weren't there before, like reincarnation, like life after death, you know, all of these different things. And we're going to do it with the idea that even the churches will help us, because they don't want to lose everyone to this scientific materialism. So this is what Steiner is terming this harmonic force that sweeps in and really has this heyday once we get to 1840. And so we see a lot of ups and downs go on there. But basically, Blavatsky is their answer in the end. The Western initiators come forward and say, this is who we should have. Now, one of the things which is important to point out here is that Blavatsky says, you know, I'm working directly with these masters, and they're coming in and they're going to give a new vision for the world through the Theosophical Society. And she really is looking and developing and grooming people. And that's where she comes across this political firebrand, Annie Besant, who is part of the women's suffrage movement. She is doing all this work on behalf of these different workers, the female workers, to make sure they're well represented, early labor union activities. I mean, absolutely astonishing career. And she's big on Irish home rule. So she's a respected figure way before she gets involved with Theosophy. And actually, getting involved with Theosophy at the time was equivalent to, you know, really coming out now as a political figure and saying, hey, I believe in UFOs or something. I mean, it was really kind of a far out thing for them to accept. So she really put a lot on the line to do this. And so she became one of the best leaders, I would say, of the entire movement. So now I think we have a pretty good idea of Besant. Let's take a look at one of the really important people in Henry Wallace's life. And again, Henry Wallace was FDR's VP, who was a theosophist and came from the Halcyon Temple with the Varians. If we're all on the same page for that, I know it's a lot of detail, but we're getting right to it. One quick thing I want to show is this. This is the letter from Annie Besant to John Varian. So we understand Annie Besant communicating with Varian and the Halcyon Temple, and how important that communication was. Here she is saying, you know, I believe in what you want to do with setting up this utopia idea, but make sure your wife is involved. And of course, he gets his wife on board. And then they have two amazingly gifted scientific children. And they have a channel who is called Blue Star. And we're going to get into her a little bit here too. But she starts to channel the Theosophical Ascended Master Hilarion. And Hilarion is, according to Besant, the Ascended Master that's in charge of science, and he is a big influence on all the scientists. So his whole thing is electricity, science, and we're going to see more and more as we get into this that we're looking at a real push on the mystery school side to have us apprehend the technology this time around in a totally different fashion than we have previously. Now, it's pretty interesting, too, because when you think about Varian and the two sons, and really understand that at one point, as we're going to go through the Rad Lab at MIT, that John Trump, Vannevar Bush, the Varian Brothers, and Frederick TRUMAN were all in the Rad Lab, all working tightly together, and we're all, proteges or supporters of each other. And then you realize that Vannevar Bush is in charge of the UFO file, that John Trump is in charge of the Nikola Tesla papers, and that the Varian Brothers come out of Theosophy and come out of this master Hilarion, Halcyon intentional community in California that Henry Wallace is a part of. You understand that picture in a totally different fashion. It's like we're looking now at history turned upside down. And I'll tell you, there is no one who, in my experience in doing this research, has ever brought it up or brought to the attention of the public that Henry Wallace and Halcyon and the Varians and Vannevar Bush and Trump were all linked. This is new. This is a new thread that we're following here. And we're doing it together. And that's what I think is so important about the shows that we're up to right now. How you doing over there, Olivia?
Excellent.
Excellent. How are the questions tonight?
I'm going to have a hard time keeping up, I can tell you that much.
It's a great crowd. It's fantastic. It's great to have so many people here. Wow. I'm so pleased that everyone is following this series because the information is so important. It can be dense at times, I realize, but the connections are so intense and they're so obvious and in our face that they can really open up an entirely new avenue of research. And that's really what we're doing here collectively with each other. Now, Olivia, if you want to fire a question at me now while I get into the Nicholas Roerich material, that would be...
Sure. Christian Kornchuk says, I need more Dark Journalist on Hagman Report. Fantastic. I loved it. And Scott Davis says, when are you going to do something with Stan Deo?
Thank you for reminding me. I was on the Hagman Report on Tuesday night, and it was a fantastic show. I really like both Doug and Joe. They're amazing guys. And Doug, as I'm finding out, is actually a PI and has done some novels about his work. But they do an incredible show. And one of the guests that they have is someone named Stan Deo. And Stan Deo is somebody who did the interviews that I was working with and going through on John G. Trump, because he was the one who sat down with him and did these one-on-one interviews, and where John G. Trump said to him, and I have the transcript here I'm going to read, when the FBI grabbed me, what they were looking for in Tesla's papers was a device that could pull down flying objects at a great distance, so that if I'm in Hawaii somewhere, I can press a button and take down something that's flying over the UK. But this term flying objects really grabbed me when he said it, because the conversation the FBI people are having with him is based on the fact that they've been doing surveillance of Nikola Tesla. And in just 2 years, they will start, 3 years, they'll start using the term unidentified flying object. And I started to wonder myself, is the thing that they're looking for really from Tesla's papers something that can pull down these UFOs because they want to study one? And is that what they wound up doing in some of these crashes that we heard about later, like Roswell? This starts to make more sense to me. The idea of just a random crash and us moving in for all of these doesn't make sense. I think that's how it started. And then at a certain point, we were like, we need more information. How can we figure out how to pull one of these things down? And that Klystron technology, interestingly enough, plays a role in that, as does Harry Truman, believe it or not, because one of the things I'm going to get into, if we have enough time, is this rather unusual incident that took place in Missouri when Truman was senator, and he was the one who decided what needed to be done. But basically, these were the beings that were recovered, and they look very classically like grays. But these are the drawings that were done by a reverend who was called out because they thought there was a plane crash that happened in Cape Girardeau in April of 1941. And his granddaughter came forward later and said, you know, what happened was he had a picture of these firemen out there who were holding one of these beings. And everyone in that whole neck of the woods, there were some 55 people who were sworn to secrecy over the incident. But it was Harry Truman who was in charge of the incident. And there's a whole backstory that I did an entire episode with Linda Moulton Howe that's available on my channel about what happened with the recovered technology that they took back and how the Masonic secrecy was crucial in terms of needing to know what to do with it, because we didn't even really have a Pentagon at the time this happened, because it was before Pearl Harbor. It would happen in April of 41 and Pearl Harbor's in December. Okay, so we are going to get back to that. As we were going through this, I found this picture of Lauren Bacall doing the war effort with Harry Truman. I just thought I got such a kick out of that. Olivia, you're going to love that one.
I can't wait to see it.
There it is.
Wow, was she something else?
Isn't that incredible?
Mm-hmm.
It's an amazing shot for a lot of reasons. It really captures the time. And you have Harry Truman playing piano there. And I want to say this famous quote by Harry Truman. It's a little off color, but I'm going to mention it anyway. He says, you know, I had a choice when I grew up in Missouri to become a piano player in a whorehouse or to go into politics. And at the end of the day, as I look back on it, they weren't a whole heck of a lot different. So that is Truman humor. Give him hell, Harry, telling us exactly like it is. So did I answer your last question, Olivia? Was that the end of that?
It was.
Okay, good. I know the Hagman thing. Oh, Standeo.
Oh, yeah.
So Standeo and I had a spontaneous, they called him in because it just so happened on the Hagman show that he was coming in at the same time as I was. And so he was the following guest. And they asked me, you know, they said, well, your work is so related. And I was like, yeah, well, of course, I'm pulling on Standeo's work on Pine Gap in my X series. I'd be happy to. And we had a spontaneous 30, 40 minutes conversation that is up there on the Hagman and Hagman channel. That is just incredible. And the knowledge of Standeo around the UFO file, Pine Gap, and how that plays into it, how they're demonstrating the Tesla technology in Australia, and the secret groups that he worked with who called him in as a scientist there in the 1970s. So he has those 4 decades of experience in research. Absolutely phenomenal. So yes, right now he's traveling, but when he comes back, we've already talked and he's going to be on the show. So thank you for asking. Okay, so when I mentioned the Halcyon Temple, I'm guessing everyone knows what I mean now because of the series and because of what I've outlined here. In a nutshell, John Varian started it with William Dower, and it was an intentional community. They built an incredible temple there, and it's this master Hilarion from Theosophy that's supposed to be in charge of it. And again, he's part of the science ray in that whole setup of the Ascended Masters. This is a shot, and it's fascinating to even think that, you know, this is a group of ordinary people because they all look like ministers and you know, just higher spiritual beings. But here we have John Varian, who is the father of the Varian Brothers who developed the Klystron, which is the microwave technology that helped us win World War II and is the foundation technology of CERN. And this is William Dower, who was an incredible theosophist and was working with Francis Ledoux. And Francis Ledoux was the channel who they called Blue Star, who was channeling Hilarion for the community. And she would get these channeled messages, and the community kind of ran off that. And one of the things I found when I was reading about some of those messages, I started to go through Hilarion's messages that were public. And in this one message, which is from, I think, 1907, he starts talking about how everyone in Halcyon is a wireless transmitter. And I was like, this is phenomenal, because you know, you go back there and you think about this idea of being a wireless transmitter. I mean, sure, Tesla and people would be aware of that, but it wasn't very common. And it was a real like, wow, this is a century ago. And these people are giving out these messages about that. And it sounds so modern when we think about the wireless technology that we're using now. Okay, just a brief thing there with the temple. Of course, this, the theosophical symbol, and that you have the X embedded there, right directly in their logo. And there's a lot of things to say about the theosophical logo, but I think a picture says 1,000 words there. This picture is Henry Wallace at the temple, or heading in at least. And Henry Wallace is, in addition to being FDR's VP, he wasn't then, in addition to being FDR's VP, he is somebody who was a member of the temple. And they actually have, you know, check stubs from his support of joining the temple. And he became such an intricate part of learning the theosophical background and the spiritual guidance. And he's very unusual himself. If you look through various things, you're going to find in his background that he had a lot of psychic experiences as a child. And a particularly embarrassing episode that happened when he was running as vice president was that they threatened to release these things called guru letters, which leaked out. It's kind of like one of those WikiLeaks situations of his communications with someone named Nicholas Roerich. Now, Nicholas Roerich is famous for the Roerich Pact, which is something that Henry Wallace, as agriculture, you know, as the director of agriculture for America, he's the one who got FDR to sign this, but it's a wartime pact that says basically this. This is 1935, after World War I, but just before we're starting to get a hint of the tension in World War II. And the pact says when you bomb a country that you will leave alone their historical sites. Well, that's Roerich's work. Now, he's an incredible artist, and he is somebody who I would really, you know, put in an unusual category because he's a political activist, he's an artist, and he's a visiting dignitary. So he's this kind of Russian philosopher who's over here. Let's take a quick look at him. And, you know, he's very involved with helping to try to found the League of Nations and all this different things. But what happens is he becomes Henry Wallace's teacher. You know, you might say guru, but I think a better term in this setup is teacher. And his wife is channeling. His wife is a big theosophist, as he is, and they developed an offshoot called Annie Yoga, which uses all the same masters and all the same imagery from Theosophy. And his wife is channeling Moria, this master, ascended master, Moria. And she is giving these messages directly through to Wallace. And so he's getting theosophical messages from this master Moria through Roerich's wife. And he says, this is incredible. I'm going to call my good friend the president and get him involved with all this. And the president, FDR, is on records having all of these exchanges with Roerich's wife, Helena. And she is doing these kind of psychic impressions, this psychic mysticism. And we have to remember a few things about FDR. That he's much deeper into spiritualism than he's been given credit for, because one of the things that happened to him is he had a paralyzing, debilitating ailment which crippled him. And he learned through a group who was around holistic health that if he would swim on a regular basis and do certain types of treatments, he could get enough of his movement back that he could go out there and run. But still, whenever you see him in pictures, he's always accompanied very often by someone by his side who's a guy who's acting very casually, but what he's actually doing is propping up FDR. And by the end of his presidency, he's sitting there in the wheelchair, you know, and so we understand by then that he had these ailments. But when he had to appear young and dynamic, leading us through World War II and the Depression, he couldn't come off, you know, physically debilitated. So they created this whole image of him. So this holistic tie-in to his consciousness and his own role as a Mason gave him some idea about this. But through Wallace, he is getting this deep connection to Roerich and Roerich's wife, Helena. And they are giving him this impression that, these mystery schools, these higher masters, they're moving in and they are basically changing the world, and you're in the very heart of it. And the only thing that FDR would publicly say about her letters is that they were very fiery. Now, there's a lot of strange terms that come up around these letters. And I'm going to read a few things as we go along here relating to that. And another thing is that there's a weird code that goes on between FDR and Henry Wallace when they talk. And he calls FDR the fierce one in these letters. Just unusual rhetoric, I would say, for two guys, and definitely in code. All right, let's take a look now at something that you probably didn't know, because I didn't. We hear so much about the Great Seal of the United States, and we hear about the Mason influence and how George Washington, they came up with the Great Seal, and this is the imagery behind it and all the rest. It's all true. However, one thing that people don't really spotlight is how did all that imagery get on the dollar bill? And second of all, when? In fact, many people felt that, as the founding fathers put that together, and that's the dollar bill. That's what they did. They put it on the monetary unit, and that was it. As a matter of fact, no. This is what the dollar bill looked like in 1930. Front and back. No pyramid, no eye, nothing. Getting a good shot of that? Good. Who is it who puts it on the dollar bill? And this is a fact, by the way. It's not me guessing. Henry Wallace decides this is what we should do. We should put the really hardcore imagery of the United States on the monetary note. And he's agriculture minister at the time. I mean, he's the agriculture secretary. He's not the treasury secretary. He's not even the VP yet. He's an agriculture guy. But he has that pipeline with FDR, and he says, we're going to put this on the bill, and it's going to change the entire dynamic. And their little mystical game back and forth is going to give us this on our monetary unit, which, of course, everyone and their grandmother goes after on the conspiracy side. But it is fascinating, the all-seeing eye and the pyramid, let's face it. And here, no, that's not counterfeit. It's just a picture. But we can see that the Great Seal here, the United States, and suddenly we've got the pyramid. But guess what? That's series 1935. Before that, no way. Kind of surprising if you think about it. The next thing that's unusual about it is how on earth did Henry Wallace have the impact? I mean, we can see maybe because where he got the inspiration for it, he's part of the Halcyon Theosophical Temple. He understands the deeper realities. He's already deep, deep into this. But you might say, how on earth did he have the kind of clout with FDR to get this to happen? And what were they up to, really? That is absolutely fascinating question, and we're going to try to answer that here. Let's take a look at another act from 1935 that the Agriculture Secretary pulled off. This is a picture of FDR and Henry Wallace, who is Agriculture Secretary but will become Vice President in 1940, signing the Roerich Pact with 22 different nations in 1935, saying, we will not bomb the historical or creative cultural centers when we're at war with other countries. That's pretty impressive for an agriculture secretary, let's face it. But it's also unusual, and we can see that tight bond developing with FDR and Wallace, because Wallace is almost becoming a spiritual inspiration to him, and they're on the same beam for sure. Now, here's another thing we need to keep in mind about Roerich. What's unusual about him? So many things. Claims that he's been to Shambhala, okay? Now, this is quite possibly true, considering he goes deep, deep into the heart of Central Asia. He's dealing with mystery schools there. He's an unusual figure, for sure, and we could do a show just separately on him. But suffice to say, he's someone who made an incredible impact everywhere he went, but he's an artist, remember. He's not even, he's also a political activist, but his main thing is that he's an artist. And his art is in very great demand. Now, the thing about Roerich that is fascinating is that he does a trek through the Himalayas, and he keeps a record of it. And the book comes out, the story, in 1927. He keeps a journal. And what is it that he notes in his journal in 1927? That when he's in the Himalayas, a large craft, basically it's one of the first UFO sightings, sits there over his group, rotating. And, what's fascinating about a guy like him is, for him, this isn't even something so wild to say. He's already talked about ascended masters, Shambhala, the great change in man's destiny, and also that there's this incredible Syrian stone, like from the planet Sirius, that is something the mystery schools hold and has this tremendous power, kind of almost like the Philosopher's Stone type thing. So he's known to talk about very wild things, of course. But this, in 1927, nobody even knows what it's all about, because after all, UFOs don't become in the popular genre of speaking and trading information until 1947, at least. So we're looking at something really fascinating that's going on there. So Roerich is having this kind of wild experience with UFOs and seeing UFOs and talking about Shambhala. Well, at the same time, there's someone who's very close to the Varians, who, his name is George Russell, and in Theosophy, they know him as A.E. And A.E. is an incredibly famous Irish artist, and he's one of the big theosophists that come in from Ireland, like John Varian. And he grows up with the Varians. In fact, Russell Varian, if I had his picture handy, I'd put it back up. But Russell Varian is named after George Russell. So this is George Russell. And George Russell is an incredible spiritual artist. And if you've been watching the shows, you'll know that I put up this painting about Blavatsky's true form as seen on the astral plane. And it was Russell who drew it. He had an incredible impact on the different artist communities at the time. And in theosophical circles, he was absolutely regarded as an artist, a poet, mystic. And what's fascinating about him is there's a whole chapter in his biography talking about how everywhere he was going at a certain phase, when he developed a certain spiritual, level after he developed there, that everywhere he would go, and he's writing this in 1923, that there were airships that would show up. And he was trying to deduce the intelligence behind the airships, and if they were something that he was generating, or if they were something that were natural phenomena, or if they were from other planets or whatever. So he's walking around and these UFOs are showing up. It's basically the upshot of that. So we've got Roerich, who is seeing UFOs, creating the Roerich Pact, influencing Henry Marshall, and Henry Marshall working closely with FDR to get the Roerich Pact passed, and FDR working closely with Marshall to get the Great Seal of the United States placed on our monetary unit. That's a lot going on here, which impacts the public in a certain way. But as we're starting to see deeper, these characters are really making an impact in our everyday life. And what happens with Roerich, and it's unfortunate, that's the shot of how Blavatsky, that Russell drew, who was a great artist. This is how Blavatsky apparently appears on the astral plane. She is basically kind of a warrior Atlantean goddess princess with some pretty masculine qualities there too. But this is the kind of power of the vision of Russell. And remember that Russell is who Russell Varian is named after. Again, this theosophical tradition influencing science in the early 20th century. So, I think that what we're looking at here is Roerich hits this kind of plateau when he's dealing with Marshall. His wife is doing these daily updates and getting information to Wallace. And Wallace is, he's taking it all in. He's thinking these are almost like his spiritual parents. They are giving him these downloads from the master. They're there in the heart of the thing. They want a new world. And what they do is FDR and Wallace devise this idea through agriculture to send him on a trip, that is Roerich, to a trip to Central Asia to develop some kind of hybrid plant material that will help farmers here in America. It's a very unusual expedition for this. And what happens is one of the things that are found on this expedition are 300 unknown texts from the inner heart of Asia that are ancient and no one was aware of them. Now, that is absolutely fascinating for a lot of reasons, because what happens is the actual expedition falls apart. Everywhere Roerich goes, he has a kind of a political flair to him, and he thinks that he can arouse all of these Buddhists in these different countries around Russia to rise up and kind of overthrow the governments in there and create this Shambhala there in the public. And he's sort of, at times on the run at gunpoint, as he points it out himself. But it's a disaster for the Roosevelt's administration, because he's starting to look like a flake and an agitator, and our allies are getting upset with what he's up to. He looks, Roerich looks more like a rabble-rouser, and we kind of lose that connection. We lose that, connection between Roerich and Roosevelt. And in the public support of Roerich, forget it. It's over. So Wallace can only converse with him in private, and that's where those guru letters come out that later damage Wallace so much. So we get an idea there of the working relationship now between FDR and Henry Wallace. And I think it's important to think about with Henry Wallace, which is that he's coming out of the Theosophical tradition. He is lining up to basically become the first Theosophical president. And he is also lining up to become the first ex-president. So let's look at who stopped him. And how he was stopped. That's also pretty crucial. There's a quote in here I wanted to read. Let's see. Yes. Yeah, there's a few things in there about Truman that are kind of worth looking at. But basically, what I want to touch on briefly is Vannevar Bush. So Vannevar Bush, let's take a quick look at him. He's the head of the Rad Lab. He is also in charge of the UFO file. He's the head of Raytheon. He is U.S. science advisor. He's the top dog. He responds directly to FDR. And what he says at a certain point, he's also a master Mason, and he worshipful master of the Mitchard McLaren Lodge, which eventually became the MIT Lodge. And I pointed that out a few times. There's a picture of it. Very simple building. I went there, and I think it's got a kind of there are a lot of mysteries that have taken place there. Vannevar Bush with Harry Truman and the president of Harvard. Of course, that's Truman. That is Vannevar Bush, and over there is the president of Harvard. There's one aspect of the Rad Lab, and that's Vannevar Bush in the middle. So we get an idea, just some visuals to kind of keep that in mind, to kind of keep that connection of Vannevar Bush. The Rad Lab is where we get, this is where they developed it. That's an overhead shot of the Rad Lab. And that's where we got the technology developed to develop the radar that the Varians had put together and to implement all these classified programs. Now, one of the things about the classified programs that turns up, and it's pretty fascinating, is that, we're looking at basically the development of X technology. It's not allowed to go out to the public, and they have the perfect cover, which is it's a wartime effort. In fact, they're utilizing aspects of the X technology to win World War II, but they're kind of vouchsafing the big major elements of it because they don't quite understand how it works. And that's where the UFO file comes in. So when we have that big incident around Cape Girardeau and we have Truman in charge of that, it lifts his profile dramatically. Before that, he's kind of a nobody senator in Missouri, and he does not have a lot of clout. He's part of what is called the Pendergast machine in Democratic controlled circles in Missouri. And, he was from, he developed a clothing business that failed, and he didn't even go to college. So he's the only 20th century president who didn't go to college. So he has a kind of an unusual pedigree, in a sense, to be in this position to rise to the presidency. And he was nowhere near the presidency in 1940 when Henry Wallace became the VP with FDR. What happens is the 1941 Cape Girardeau incident raises his profile because it takes him and his Masonic secrecy working with the Cape Girardeau recovered technology, bringing it to Washington, D.C. And I've done an episode on this, as I pointed out, with Linda Moulton Howe about how all that went down. So I won't get into too much of that here, but basically the idea is this. When he does that, it raises his profile, and he becomes kind of the toast of the inner circle. And they decide this is somebody who we need not only to raise up to a 33rd degree Mason, but he's somebody we need to bring in to higher levels of that and the higher levels of political power. And the deep state is really behind him because he doesn't know a whole heck of a lot. That is, they call him Give Him Hell Harry. And I think he had a lot of heart. And eventually he saw the way that he was manipulated, and he made good by joining forces with Kennedy and basically throwing elements of the CIA in the proper light, in the proper context, and showing them up, because he developed the CIA and it was kind of hoisted on him. But through this whole process, this clash between Henry Wallace, who's going to be president in 1945, not Truman, he goes back, and if you really look back, that period, his first term, Harry Truman's, is heavily manipulated with the National Security Act, the development of the CIA, and the incredible wall of secrecy around the UFO file. All those things happen, including the development of the State of Israel and the founding of the United Nations. That's all in Truman's first term. That would have been under the auspices of Henry Wallace. He would have been President X there, the 33rd president. He was already the 33rd vice president. So what happens is, oddly enough, during this process of the election itself, they win an unprecedented fourth term for FDR in 1944. But just before that, as the election is heating up, who's been in the bullpen for 4 years? It's FDR's VP, the Halcyon Temple Theosophist, who's been hanging out with Nicholas Roerich and coming from this totally kind of enlightened space. Well, that's our friend, Henry Wallace. He's the VP. He's the tight friend with FDR. He's the agriculture secretary that got the Great Seal of the United States on the dollar bill. He's lined up. He's going in. He's going to become President X. He's going to be the one who moves in there. He is the theosophical choice. Those mystery schools have sized him up and said, this is our guy, and they've worked with him his whole life, including those strange visions and all his connections as he gets older. But what is the force that brings it down? It is the inclusion out of the blue of Truman at the convention to become FDR's vice president. And here's how it worked. All of the delegates were counted, and the percentage which our friend Wallace was ahead is gigantic. He had something like 400 to 22 in terms of delegates. And what happened was, before his name was going to be entered in as vice president at that convention in 1944, the Truman powers, the powers that hoisted Truman into the White House, call fire in the convention. Now, everyone knew that there was something wrong with this. And of course, there was no fire. But they get everyone cleared out of the convention hall. 24 hours later, Harry Truman's vice president. He went from practically no votes to winning. And also, it was an unusual process because popularity-wise, Wallace was a lot more popular. Well, FDR himself wasn't too happy about this, but he was very fixed on what he was doing, and he didn't get involved with it. But the way that he dealt with it is he didn't deal much with Truman. As a matter of fact, he didn't even tell him about the atomic bomb. So when FDR dies, Truman is the babe of the deep state. He's a babe in arms. He doesn't know anything. He is just the haberdasher that was propped up, and he was thrown out there. He didn't even have a very well guided education. And he was run through by the Pendergast machine. And, you know, I'm going to say this about Truman, which is he makes up for it later. He makes up for it later because he understands what was done. And, you know, he does become the president, and he does win an upset victory against Dewey in 1948. But I want to say, for what they did, for what they were preparing, it was their idea to put Truman in because the main block was on get Wallace out. Wallace, the Theosophist, was going to be in charge of the UFO file. He was going to be in charge of the X technology. He was the mystery school choice. They wanted him in there. They wanted a new era of enlightenment with him raising the minimum wage, giving people health care, you know, taking us away from foreign wars, and all the rest of it. This is where they were at with him. And there was so much interference going on in relation to what was happening with Wallace as vice president, becoming president. But here's the thing. Within 3 months of that election, of the inauguration, 82 days as vice president, Truman becomes president, and FDR dies April 12th. So what we have there is they understood FDR's health very well. They knew whoever was the VP was going to be running the show, would have to drop the atom bomb, would have to approve the UN, and would have to help create the state of Israel, all those things. In fact, it gets very, very dicey because without those things, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly that are going on, it's a very different picture that we would roll into the 50s with, because we had won the war. We had this kind of incredible upper hand. But what happens instead is we limber on through this incredible warfare state, and we roll into the Korean War in the 50 to 53. That's all Truman, and that's Truman. And what do we get? We get the deep state. We get the CIA. We get the National Security Act of 1947 that creates an entirely underground corridor of black budget money. And we get the UFO file secrecy. That's the legacy in earnest. Instead, what could we have had in this battle? Well, let's go back into Wallace for a moment and look at some of these, some of the things that went down there. An aspect of the Masonic groups had been infiltrated by this, we're calling it an Ahrimanic force coming in. They developed the CIA. They come into this kind of, you know, there's so many Masonic lodges, there's so many Masonic, there's such a Masonic history, there's so many things in relation to the influence of Masonry in this country that, you know, for one lodge to stand up and prop up Harry Truman doesn't make all Masons evil by a long shot. But the point is that this idea of secrecy was going to be so important, which is why Truman becomes a 33rd degree Mason instead of just 32 as FDR was, and 32 the way that Wallace was, because there's always been this little tension about it that if you're a 33rd degree Mason, where do your loyalties lie? You know, can you have the loyalty to the office, or do you have the loyalty to the lodge? This is a kind of a larger question that goes down, but it's absolutely present there. Now, in the course of Truman taking over the reins, I showed a picture earlier of the first defense secretary, who was named James Forrestal. And what he does is he becomes a major member of the UFO file, working with Vannevar Bush. And I have pictures of them together. This is Forrestal with Truman. And Truman has absolute faith in Forrestal. But Forrestal was close with Wallace, and he's shocked to be working with Truman because he thought, I'm going to be serving President Wallace. And what happens as we get along in time is that Vannevar Bush and Forrestal form the core of MJ-12, which is the group that's put in there to kind of oversee the UFO file. And for people who've looked at this, who are like, well, I'm not sure about MJ-12, what it happens to be, there's no doubt that there have been manipulated MJ-12 documents, but there are documents I cited earlier from physicist Robert Sarbarker and from Canadian officials that show that Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO file program. So that fits. This was the, I'll show a couple of pictures here. This is a picture of Truman with Prendergast, and they used to call him Senator Pendergast because what would happen is basically Pendergast owned the Democratic machine, and he was using Truman as a puppet. And Truman was doing the best that he could. I mean, he was kind of a small town guy who had gotten incredible influence working in this Mason lodge. And he, of course, was a master Mason, became a 33-degree Mason, and they really wanted him because what they needed the most was the secrecy. So this is how that situation developed. Just to give a quick look at, this is actually the Anti-Masonic Almanac for the year of our Lord 1835. And there have been incredible battles on both sides because there was all these efforts to get rid of Masonry and get rid of the Mason lodges that took place in the 1900s, and there were purges and all the rest of it. And it had to survive all of that superstitious stuff, power grabs. There were other secret societies that didn't want anything to do with Masonry. So we had these battles going on, and they actually here in Boston had this almanac, and it shows basically, you know, them kind of bloodletting this guy's heart and, you know, doing this thing. And I've got a close-up of this, which I'll show, where they have all these X's on their apron, which I just thought was quite an interesting touch. Now, let's just go back here to Defense Secretary Forrestal. Forrestal, from all accounts, with MJ-12, first thing we have to know about Forrestal is, and this is a picture of JFK visiting his gravesite. Forrestal is a very important character for a lot of reasons. He was the head of the Dillon Reed Wall Street company and investment firm. He was also the first defense secretary of the United States. He was the secretary of the Navy when Wallace was in there as VP under FDR. And what happens actually, in essence, which I find quite fascinating, is when he gets into the MJ-12 end of things, he gets very emotional about the fact that there are others here. And so he's looking at crash technologies. He's looking at these reports and diagrams of bodies and everything else. And he's saying, oh, there's an off-world civilization. We need to tell people about it. And there's a story about how he actually had a telepathic link with one of the beings who wasn't dead yet, that he was looking at, that they had recovered from a crash. And remember that it was Truman who had recovered the craft and bodies from this the Cape Girardeau crash, which gave him all this clout in the first place in 1941. So a few years later, Forrestal's working with these different groups. He's in MJ-12, and he is overseeing the UFO file with Vannevar Bush. They've worked together before. And by the way, I want to say something interesting about Vannevar Bush in relation to Henry Wallace, who was going to be President X before we got Truman. Vannevar Bush said about Wallace that he understood the secrets of our weaponry and atomic weaponry better than anyone else in the Truman administration. That's really fascinating because he's an agriculture secretary. So what is Vannevar Bush talking about? you see how this starts to click with the fact that Frederick Terman, who founded Silicon Valley, who was the major protege and mentor of the Varian Brothers at Stanford, and how they came out of Halcyon with all this scientific knowledge. And then we look at the fact that as soon as Henry Wallace becomes the VP, he works closely. And I have a letter here of vouching for him scientifically from Vannevar Bush. Something is going on there which relates directly to this X situation. I'm going to see if I can grab this. There's, this should have been a two-parter, right, Olivia? Because now I'm deep into it. Lord of mercy. How are we doing out there?
Fantastic. I can't even keep up.
As it should be, right? Do you have a question you want to shoot while I'm getting this?
So J.H. Armstrong is asking, so Wallace would have revealed the big secret, quote, technology?
First of all, it's pretty understood that Wallace would have never dropped the atomic bomb. That is something that, historians have wrangled over it, but there was no reason at that point during the war to do it. This is basically what it comes down to. That whole debate and discussion is kind of fascinating. But the truth is that he understood that the world was moving into this different era. He comes out of Theosophy. He comes out of Halcyon. They understand the UFO file. They understand the X Steganography, and they understand how dangerous it is to humanity. But he's somebody who's looking at getting people back onto the land, to developing the farmers again, to raising our spiritual level. And this is something I'm going to make clear about him, which is he's coming from a completely spiritual edge. And I'm going to read a few quotes to demonstrate that. But this is the Vannevar Bush letter to FDR. And I'm just going to read it briefly. And it's the Office for Emergency Management and Scientific Research and Development, Vannevar Bush Director, March 1942, to the President. And what it says is, Dear Mr. President, on October 9th, Mr. Henry Wallace and I presented you the status of research in this country and Great Britain on a possibly powerful explosive, referring to the atomic bomb, we presume. In accordance with your instructions, I have expedited this work in every way possible. I now attach a brief summary of report to the status on the matter. Considerations of general policy and international relations have been limited to the President, to a group consisting of Henry Wallace, Secretary Stinson, George Marshall, and myself. Mr. Wallace called a conference of this group to which he invited Harold D. Smith in the matter of funds that were considered. But basically, I want to show that Wallace is working closely with Vannevar Bush on the atomic program. Bush is in charge of the Rad Lab. Bush is in charge of the Varians, who were two Theosophical Halcyon brothers, created the Klystron in there, with Frederick Trump, who was the one in charge of Nikola Tesla's papers. We're getting a string there. We're understanding where the X technology is moving, where that UFO file comes in. Vannevar Bush is in charge of that. He's in charge of this. The two worlds, the two technologies are coming together. And this is what so much of this is about. And Wallace is about to become the ex-president in 1944. In the election, all he has to do is ride it out as VP, and 82 days later, he will be president. That's what would have happened. Instead, we got a very, very unusual situation. But here's an interesting crisscross. And I know it's a lot of people to keep track of, but we are connecting these dots, and these people are, they are points on a board that we can go back to again and again. So if we lose one, or if you lose track of somebody, don't worry, we're coming back to them. Here is a shot, and it's the only shot, of Vannevar Bush with Secretary Forrestal. Now, Secretary Forrestal, after he joins the MJ-12 group, and he speaks out and says, basically, we have to share this stuff with the American people. We're going to have a better time of it, actually. It'll be easier to manage. And we need to get a lot of this out, and I have these ideas about it. And they basically look at him, and a lot of them are generals and scientific people, including Donald Menzel, And they're like, thank you for sharing. Thank you. That's great. He gets out of that meeting and instantly he's hit with hardcore news stories. One of the news stories is James Forrestal. Do you know what he did? He embezzled all these people when he was at Dillon and Reed. James Forrestal, forget it. He left his wife for his secretary. James Forrestal, he was doing tax evasion. So he becomes smeared left, right, and upside down. So in this purge that's going on, Wallace now, who was close, and remember the picture earlier, Wallace and Forrestal, they understand a lot of things about this, you know, with the secrecy aspect. But Forrestal now is looking around and getting smeared after opening up about this MJ-12 and his position on it. And what happens next is Truman fires Wallace, who, after he didn't get in as VP and then president, was appointed anyway by Roosevelt as Treasury Secretary, which is a pretty powerful position. So Truman's like, you know what, get rid of him. Get him out of here. Because there's a purge that's happening in these circles. And the next purge is going to be Forrestal, because Forrestal, inside of this incredibly tight-knit unit that Vannevar Bush has put together. And remember, Vannevar Bush, Master Mason himself, one of the things that came up is the Wall Street Journal article looking at Vannevar Bush and the Rad Lab and saying, they have better, tighter security, more secrecy going on than the Army does. And, you know, whatever is going on there, they're like the first intelligence unit. And they become, of course, not only crucial for the development of the Trinity site and all the things that happened with the atomic program in the Manhattan Project, but they are absolutely crucial to the secrecy of the UFO file. Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy, first Secretary of Defense for the United States, he's singing a totally different song, not into the secrecy on this at all. Who is Forrestal communicating this stuff to? Remember I told you it was going to come back to Kennedy. Well, he's Catholic. Kennedy's Catholic. Kennedy's a congressman, and they are best friends. He takes Kennedy with him to post-war Berlin to say, look at the mess that we created, basically, and the rebuilding that was going on. And for all intents and purposes, shares the information on the UFO file with Kennedy. When Kennedy gets into office in 1960, he understands. He's got the MJ-12 knowledge from Forrestal. That instantly sets up the dynamics with the deep state forces, the Aromatic forces working through the Central Intelligence Agency. That's where the clash happens. That's where he says, we need to open up the secrecy. Now, one of the things I had on this program was attorney Douglas Caddy, who's the Watergate lawyer, and his close friend was E. Howard Hunt, who was the CIA super spy. And Hunt said to him before he went to prison for Watergate crimes, and many of you who follow the program know this, that when Caddy asked him why was JFK assassinated, he said he was assassinated because he was going to give our most vital secret to the Soviets. And he said, what's the most vital secret? And he said, the UFO file, you know, the alien presence. That's the thing that he wanted to open up. And of course, there's all these NASA documents with Kennedy saying we need to start the sharing program. So this is the genesis of all that, which is when we're looking at Vannevar Bush shake hands with Forrestal, they're both working MJ-12. And as soon as he gives his real opinion, we need to open this up, share it with the public, because he's had some weird interaction in observing this material. I don't know if he actually saw a body or not, but the story is basically that the whole thing disturbed him and that he felt something needed to be done beyond just keeping some secret program. This is Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of Defense. He understands secrecy very well, but he also understands secrecy that's in the best interest of the nation. This goes into a totally different territory. For him, he's saying, we'll never be able to keep this in. This is a tricky shot to see, and I dragged it out anyway because I want to give you some idea. That is Wallace with Edward Condon. And if any of you UFO buffs out there know the Condon Committee, he was the guy who was put in charge of denouncing the UFO file and saying it was all nothing, doesn't exist, or whatever. And there's a picture of Wallace with him. Here, we're going to see Kennedy taking time out of an important trip to go and visit the grave of James Forrestal. And capturing that moment, he's seeing himself in Forrestal's shoes. And of course, what happens with Forrestal? I guess we haven't got to the punchline on that. So he gets fired. He gets hounded. Truman asks for his resignation because of these phony stories about his time at Dillon Reed. The press hounds him. And even when he dies, by the way, the press hounds him, but supposedly he has a breakdown, and they put him in Bethesda Naval Hospital. And long story short, he jumps out the window with an open book of poetry left behind that says, kind of like a classic poem, kind of Goodbye, Cruel World type thing. Very classic CIA. Just think of the Catcher in the Rye themes that have been used in some of these assassinations. And he's found on the ground with, it's a 13th floor jump, basically. So they thought, now remember, this is only a year and a half after he becomes the Secretary of Defense. That's pretty fast deterioration for a normal person who was an incredibly successful person. What was it that happened? He became part of MJ-12, and he was not in on the secrecy. He was not, on with that program. He wanted to open it up. And Kennedy, his close friend, who he took to post-war Berlin, who was a fellow Catholic and who he had spent all this kind of BFF time with, he understands those things. When he dies, who is it that goes to his burial after he becomes president? It's JFK. Now, here's another interesting thing tying in the JFK story to Henry Wallace and President X, which is that Kennedy calls up Wallace, who has kind of fallen from favor after that because he ran as a progressive in 1948, independent candidate, and kind of shook up Truman's campaign. But in 1960, Kennedy wins, and in 61, he insists that Henry Wallace come to his inauguration. And he says, if you want a cabinet post, let's talk now. And Wallace says, thank you, Mr. President. You have such a great staff. I'm not even going to bother joining your cabinet, but wow, I will come to your inauguration. Showing that Kennedy understands the battle that took place back there with Forrestal, who was close to Wallace, and also with Wallace being thrown out and Truman being rushed in. And his status as a 33rd degree Mason and the infiltration of his lodge by these forces and the creation of the CIA under his watch and the creation of the National Security Act are all things that happened as a result of this dance of power that took place in 1944 when Henry Wallace was going to be our next president. But instead, we got Truman, who became president after 82 days as vice president. Okay, a couple more things to wrap up the thought here, but I think we pretty much get the idea of where this is going. But Theosophy, and remember in Theosophy, the logo, there's our X right there, which, of course, when they used it in 1880, 1885, it was pre-Nazi and all that, but there's a version that makes that X into a swastika, which is kind of fascinating, and there's a lot of reasons for why they did that. And I wanted to point these out. These are 8 anti-Masonic cartoons from the era, just as I mentioned before, there was a lot of persecution that went on. But here are these very unusual X's, skull and crossbones X's that they have going on their aprons there. So this is kind of a hit piece on the Masons, but who or what is referring to this X, skull, crossbones thing going on in this? They are referring with a knowledge to the X, very much as Besant in her unusual clothing thing when they did these ceremonies with the little black X's on the shoulder. That X is this recurring theme that we've seen over and over again, and it took kind of the high-mindedness of Besant to guide the technology through, to give us some hint that if the culture can rise up, we can use that, have it be utilized, instead of a small group utilizing the technology and suppressing the rest of us. And that is really the thing that they were concerned about the most. As a matter of fact, it said publicly in The Secret Doctrine, in Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine 2, as she's talking about Keeley's technology, she says it's the game changer, you know, but what will happen is the people, you know, the haves versus the have-nots will become a very small group that will suppress everybody else with the tech. Can't do it. So the culture itself needed to be graduated. And what happened, I think, with the big thrust of this, what we really have to get a handle on, is that there's something about Wallace coming out of the Halcyon Temple, you know, and I do have a picture of Blue Star, who was channeling Master Hilarion. And for the people at Halcyon, and Hilarion was this ascended master around science, and he is guiding this X technology to come out. And he's saying, look, you know, these are the messages. You're all wireless stations, and you're going to broadcast this message. And that was from 1907, by the way. This is Blue Star, and her name is Frances Ledoux. And she was an extraordinary person. Francia is another way, I guess they say her name. I've seen it as Francia or Francis, so it's one of the two. And she would go into trance and communicate with Hilarion, and he would give those messages for the development of the society. They have the incredible People's Temple there, which was developed under Hilarion's direction to use all these sevens in the development of it. It's a very unusual story. But I guess as far as intentional communities go, we could accept it on that level. But what about the Wallace aspect of him being a part not only of Theosophy itself, but he's a part of the People's Temple of Halcyon, the Theosophical group that broke off and that Blue Star was doing the channeling for with Master Hilarion, and who produce the Varians. And the Varians create the Rad Lab with Professor Bush. I mean, it's an incredible string of mystery school power moving to change the political landscape, moving to change the technological landscape. And we bring it right up to date today, because what happens is when we have John G. Trump and the presence of Trump in the Rad Lab with Vannevar Bush, with the Varians, with Frederick Terman, we know very well that he's part of that X-classified group. And so who is it who said, oh, I was so close to my uncle. He was such a great guy. He told me everything. He told me nuclear before nuclear even was a reality. It's Donald Trump. That is the president discussing the close relationship he had with his uncle. Did his uncle tell him about the Tesla technology and the X Steganography and the UFO file? I mean, it seems these are the connections that we need to make when we're looking at this. It's a total breakthrough. Wallace was to become, Henry Wallace was to become the president in 1945, not Truman. And he was the creation, really, of the Halcyon Temple Theosophical Society. And he did have an incredible impact on Roosevelt. And so, you know, he had his incredible impact and his influence as Agriculture Secretary. As Treasury Secretary, it was short-lived because once Truman decided, I'm going to get rid of him. But I think we get a real picture of what happened in history. And give him hell, Harry. I will say this for give him hell, Harry Truman, that after the fact, when the Kennedy assassination took place and he realized that the CIA was involved, he wrote a Washington Post editorial saying, we need to either scrap the CIA or reform it, because if you don't change it, it's going to ruin the democratic institutions of our country. And he said, I know, because I created it, in essence. And he did. So that gives us, I think, a really good handle on it. But before we go, a little side note, before we go and take your questions, that is. And it's great to see everyone out there. How are everything going over there, Miss Olivia?
Fantastic.
Excellent. Wow. You know, you always have such a great attitude. It's amazing. From beginning, midway, and all the way through the end. Just for the heck of it, I want to show us someone else from that Rad Lab, and then I'm going to tell you a very interesting fact about him. His name is George R. Harrison. And interestingly enough, he grew up with the Varians. And he was part of the People's Temple. And the R, it turns out, he's part of the Rad Lab along with the Varians and Vannevar Bush. The R stands for Russell. And who was he named after? George Russell, AE, who was the same one that Russell Varian is named after. And he's the one who drew that warrior portrait on the astral plane of Blavatsky, and he's the one who, everywhere he went, airships would show up. So that's just interesting. But anyway, a couple of quick points about him. Harrison became professor of experimental physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1930, appointed the Dean School of Science in 1942. He headed the MIT spectroscopy laboratory during World War II. He was chief of the optics division. So incredible mover and shaker, again, in that Rad Lab, again, from the Halcyon Temple. I mean, it's undeniable history. He was presented with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1946 by President Harry Truman. He remained the Dean of Science at MIT until 1964. Well, you think the Theosophical Halcyon Society had an impact? They almost had President X, right? But with the Rad Lab and the people that they put out there, an incredible, incredible impact. I do find his bio to be quite fascinating. And there is a reference in his bio at MIT that says, young George's interest in physics may have been fostered by friends of his father, the Varian Brothers, who were later to invent the Klystron, yes, and to head the electronics forum in Palo Alto, bearing their name, Varian Technologies. Kind of undeniable, these links to Halcyon and what was happening with Theosophy. But what's strange is this, and what I think we need to contemplate when we look at this whole President X situation and what the Theosophical end of it was trying versus the Masonic aspect, which had promoted Truman, is basically we're looking at a situation where the mystery schools saw the dangers of this technology. Now let's think of what the Klystron is used for now. That's the thing that they use at Lincoln Laboratories, and that's what the Rad Lab became. That's also the thing that they use at Pine Gap. And it is the fundamental basis, and I showed this 2 shows ago, of CERN, the atom smasher particle accelerator, which for all intents and purposes is trying to open up other dimensions. So you see the Theosophical Mystery School thrust of this whole thing is that they were in a dangerous position of letting this technology out too early, and we were in a dangerous position of the wrong people getting their hands on it. And that is exactly what I think has happened. So their attempt was, you know, there was a group that was trying to create a world teacher through Krishnamurti. That was one thing that got dissolved. The other thing I think that they tried very hard to do was give us President X, President Wallace. President Wallace was a spiritual thinker. Vice President Wallace was a spiritual thinker. And he was somebody who has some very unusual qualities in a politician, let's face it. As a matter of fact, FDR said he's an incredibly bright guy. He's smarter than most scientists, but he's not much of a politician, which I think was his major Achilles heel. Now, all the important things about I have to say about Wallace that I've found have largely come from looking at the lowly State Historical Society of Iowa, not from his books, not from his biographies. You're not going to find the good stuff there. Here's a couple of good things that I found. Okay. Physicist Vannevar Bush, for example, believed Wallace was the only member in the Roosevelt and Truman administration capable of fathoming the scientific intricacies of atomic energy. I pointed this out earlier as a very unusual thing to say. Wallace is an agricultural secretary and an editor of a newspaper. How does physicist Vannevar Bush think that Wallace is the only member of the Roosevelt or Truman administration capable of fathoming the scientific intricacies of atomic energy? It doesn't make sense. Obviously, Wallace was impressing him with his scientific heft, but where did he get it? And I just go back to Halcyon, which is run by Master Hilarion in Theosophy. He's the one who's in charge of science, right? A couple more things. Very deeply interested in astrology. That's something I think we'll get into in a different X episode. Henry Wallace was most captivated during the 20s and early 30s by the wisdom religion of Theosophy, religious system eminently suited to Wallace's philosophical intertwining of science and spiritualism. There's a couple more I want to read, and then we're going to go to questions. Another of Wallace's early theosophical associations was with George A.E. Russell. We've gone through him. We've shown his pictures. And we've shown that 2 of the people in the Rad Lab were named after him, including Varian's son, Russell Varian, who created the X technology, the Klystron. Russell's an Irish poet and mystic and central figure in Theosophy. Right. Henry Wallace sensed that Russell seemed to be living in another world, yet clearly desired to have that other world come true in this world, unquote. That's one of his quotes. It's great, right? You see this? This is basically the annals of Iowa, okay? You never know it's buried at a university or in the back room of a county or a state. Okay. How did my big question was through all this, how on earth did Wallace get not only involved with Theosophy and that whole spiritualist movement, but how did he get involved with that small breakaway group, the Halcyon Temple group of Theosophy, when there's so many other things, and he's in Iowa, they're in California? It doesn't make any sense. And I kept looking for an answer there. And so what it turns out that he was involved with Theosophy, and there were these 2 people that he knew, Charles and Juanita, who were involved with a group known as the Society of the Temple of the People. Charles, in fact, had been associated with the temple for 21 years. So somebody who'd been there basically for most of their adult life. The temple was led by William H. Dower and Francia Ledoux. I've shown both of them. And the temple was an offshoot of the Theosophical Society Lodge. In November 31, Wallace sent annual dues to the temple and began correspondence in its brand of Theosophy, checking in with the temple and learning the lessons. Dower, who's the leader of the People's Temple, Halcyon, characterized him as a very fine student whose answers to course questions indicated a splendid knowledge of Theosophy's fundamental. He understood. I had mentioned earlier about Wallace that he got Roosevelt to put the Great Seal of the United States on the dollar bill, on the monetary unit. He thought it was important. This is a way to kind of imprint it in our subconscious as we use our money to keep thinking of these mystical principles. Dower, who was the head of the Halcyon Temple, wrote that it was clear that Western civilization was based on commercialism and the competitive system, and it was so caught up in modern technology, sounds familiar, and it was wrong at the root. He invoked a credo of the early American Republic. He asserted that the only remedy was a new order of the ages. I could go on with this, but basically the idea is that this is what jolts Wallace, and he says, absolutely, let's put the American seal on the dollar bill. So we can see his great spiritual kind of understanding. The last thing I want to point out here is that Dower, who was mystical like Blavatsky in his own way, He told Wallace that he had an earlier life as one of the Iroquois Indians, and that's where his desire for a spiritual connection with the land came from. But I thought that was kind of interesting when you get right down to it. There's one last quote that I have in here before we take questions. And this is now, we've said a lot of things about Henry Wallace, and certainly we can see that he was going to be president, but that the forces behind the kind of darker aspects influenced this Masonic group to push Truman. And this was a political mystery school battle. So it's, you know, it's not like we could say all Masons were bad or all the mystery school people were up to something. It's that there are influences here that we need to see that would get infiltrated. And there are political groups who will use this political power. They'll use the mystical aspects of these groups. They'll use the Masonic gift for secrecy to hide the UFO file, for example. You know, so we have to take a larger picture of this and just understand who these players are, so you get a better handle on how to handle them and how to really understand the powers that they control at this point. He says great things in here about FDR, and he said FDR had incredible hunches, i.e. psychic ability, intuition, knew things were going to happen. As we pointed out earlier, FDR certainly had these kinds of abilities. But this is, in his own words, Wallace talking in spiritual lingo. And this came out in the so-called Guru letters, which were letters between him and Roerich. And these were used to actually kind of take down his political career. So let's take a look at it. I can see there's an occasional fragrance from that other world, which is the real world. But for now, I must live in the outer world while preparing myself for a more spiritual future. Seems like it's a pretty spiritual thought he had there. He had insisted to Roerich in these letters that the search, whether it be for the lost word of Masonry or the Holy Chalice, or the potentialities of the age to come, is the one supremely worthwhile objective. All else is karmic duty. He's talking about karma here in the late 20s. It's pretty exceptional. All else is karmic duty. Here is life. But surely every one is a potential Galahad, a Parsifal, incurring the utmost peril insofar as his energy in this search in terms of the outer world, suggesting the spirit of the coming political struggles. What will happen is obvious. Our seat is perilous in letters of fire, for the one who has won the right to come by using the inner principles to conquer the outer world will always experience a challenge. What an adventure, what patience, what grief. And Wallace had them all. He was going to be President X, and it was snatched away from him by this group. And the group developed MJ-12 out of that, and they were able to drop the atom bomb and form the United Nations and the National Security Act and the CIA out of that. So it's quite a switch in history. But we have to see that the mystery schools, through Theosophy, through that Halcyon Temple, and again, those connections to Halcyon and the People's Temple, over and over again, this X work goes back and back to the Varians, the MIT Rad Lab, and Wallace. So with that, I will now turn this episode over to the very able hands of young Olivia.
Okay. There are just too many great questions. So let's dive right in to the dollar bill.
Yes.
Okay. So I've got 3 questions on that. Martin De Beer, any reason for the symbolism only on the $1 bill? Let's start with that one.
I don't know if they thought about, I know that what came up is they were thinking about doing it as the coin, having a coin that would incorporate it, and that it actually, it came to Roosevelt that the first idea was a better one. So he went back to the original idea that Wallace gave him. But I want us all to keep this in mind as far as Wallace goes. Here's an agriculture secretary setting up the Rorke Pact with FDR, and FDR signing it with 22 other nations, including Paris and England and all the rest of it. So it's an incredible impact for somebody who doesn't have that big of a job. And I think that shows that tight kind of relationship that FDR had with him. Okay.
Black Market Medicine just threw in unity, ? Being the $1 bill, which I kind of like. And Peter Bayonne says, so the powers that be inverted the true meaning or intent behind Wallace's seal on our currency?
Well, I wouldn't say they inverted it, because I think in a way he got one over on them, because he got this idea that if we were using the mystery symbolism on our monetary unit, that it would change the consciousness of the country. And eventually what got adopted out of that was the "In God We Trust." So it really is quite a spiritual statement. And it is those kind of subtle things that make a difference. Another thing I'll say about Wallace is that the farming practices and the things that he developed over that period of time, really, changed the course of how we do farming in America. And he created a lot of hybrid seeds, but he's always looking for that kind of organic, pure approach. And he would have thrown something like Monsanto, as far away from the country and our policies as you can imagine. So that understanding he had as a background coming out of a farming family in Iowa, I think informed a lot of what he did. But let's remember, too, that his dad was the agriculture secretary under Wilson. Interesting background.
Okay, JJK wants you to speculate on Forrestal's death.
Oh, I don't think there's any speculation that needs to be had there. I think what happened was he didn't agree with the secrecy around MJ12. They had put him in there, and he just thought it was totally wrong, the way that they were approaching it, which was, he certainly believed in secrecy, and he worked as Secretary of the Navy during the Manhattan Project. But the UFO file, I think what happened to him, in the speculation part, is that he got some kind of communication either from looking at the material or from an actual being when they took him in to see it. Because let's remember that one of the things that happened with the whistleblower with Nixon was that Nixon was shown one of these beings. So when Nixon was in charge of the CIA Blue Book, which is different from the regular Project Blue Book, all that seems like very consistent testimony to me. I think that what we have to do is, when we look at Forrestal, is see that he was the first defense secretary of the United States, but he didn't really play well with the new intelligence agency of the United States that was in development. And that was Allen Dulles'. So that's really what caused the clash there. And though suddenly he goes from being the toast of the town to, getting hit with really sleazy charges from his time during Wall Street, which is 1936. So they were just ready to hit him. It was a hit, and that's all there was to it. Now, working on him to a point where he became a nervous mess, and somebody checking him in to Bethesda, I wonder how much of that was even done under his own will. But they broke him down, and it's clear. They threw him out the window and claimed it was a suicide. So that's, I think that cost them, though, because JFK became very aware of what they were willing to do over the UFO file. And I think when he came in, he understood them a lot better. So gave them, and even though they removed JFK, that deep state element, I don't think that they expected the incredible challenge to the CIA that he gave them. And I think that a lot of that is because, as we could see in that picture of JFK visiting the grave, we're looking at someone in JFK who picks things up very quickly, incredibly smart, and who had a very close friend who took him under his wing, basically, when he was a congressman, fellow Catholic, and brings him to post-war Berlin. To see him die in his 40s, thrown out a window, that's pretty cold deep state action. And I think it stuck with Kennedy, honestly.
David Donaway, so how long have other dimensional beings been inspiring the technological progress of humanity? Did 2001 get something right?
Yes, absolutely. That's an amazing, incredible film, which I've seen many times with Olivia.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I would say about this, though, is they have always had that impact. Even if you go into anthroposophy, he's talking about these advanced beings making an impact. And some of them, when they make that impact, just like Enoch with the Watchers, they think that they're doing the right thing, but they might give us something a little bit faster than need be. We might use it the wrong way. Think about Atlantis. Think about what this is all really about when we talk about the X Steganography and hiding this effect through time. And even when you get to the UFO file, we're developing a new brand, a new X enigma to go out. One that's been carried over, the Keeley technology, the Tesla technology, that certainly falls into that X category. It has something to do with the warping of the reality. And that effect, which I call apophthegm, is really something that is very detectable in UFO incidents, because people say, well, the engine shut off, my clock spun, suddenly I had no sense of time, I had missing time and all this stuff. Obviously, it messes with reality itself. Those aren't, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, it was they got hypnotized in their abduction experience, but that doesn't explain electronic anomalies. So there's an effect that you get a glimpse of there, but you don't only get a glimpse of it in terms of UFO activity. When Annie Besant was describing first meeting a master, she said the walls were throbbing. Now, let's think about that, because Besant was not somebody who was really, she wasn't prone to wild poetic prose. She was a very kind of straight ahead woman. And what kind of effect is there, when these worlds meet? There definitely is an unseen force. And we've been working with that unseen force all the way back to Atlantis, for sure. Okay. Wesley
Lance, where did all of these mystery schools go to? I attempted to look into them, but there's really no information out there. Like, they just disappeared.
Indeed. They warned about this too. But what they said, and I always go back to Steiner because I think that he understood what was to happen. He is so far ahead of his time. When we look 21st century, we're starting to catch up to him. But what he's saying is this. He said, if anthroposophy and the spiritual movements fail, this is 1960. He said, we're gonna put all our stuff out. I'm even going to put out secret stuff that was not out before. But if anthroposophy fails, there's going to be a quarter of time, a window, 100 years from now. And this whole thing will have the opportunity to succeed then. I think there's no doubt that the movements gradually degenerated. And I think when you get to the Alice Bailey style material, it's a different league. It's removed. It is a different, I'm not saying that there's no value in any of that, but it's that, it's interesting. There's a quote from Steiner when he looks at Theosophy, and he said, in his own autobiography, he said, at its cradle stood true initiators. Absolutely. But what happens is these mystery schools have to roll the dice with us. And what happens on their part is we might take something that they let out. For example, like the Nazis might take the swastika from Theosophy and take their idea of Aryans and say, hey, we're a super race. Is that Blavatsky's fault? No, it is. They've made the material available. They've put it out, and it gets distorted. Or maybe people will walk around thinking, oh, I'm talking with the master all the time, and not taking into account, the Steiner type lessons about not daydreaming, to such an extent that you lose the balance between reality and daydreaming. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of effects, there's a lot of things about us when we're dealing with this. So the mystery schools kept themselves really underground until 1840. And with the scientific materialism that crept in, this backlash was created. And they decided, you know what, it's nice to keep this stuff from humanity and help them grow and do everything we can. And I think that there are those groups that coexist in the larger sphere of evolutionary principles on Earth. But the truth is that they wanted to go along the way they were going along. But this acceleration of what Steiner refers to as harmonic forces, which we're dealing with now in the 21st century, is incredible nanotechnology that's just going to take over everything after the space fence hits, right? That's the reality. But when they're looking at it, they're thinking, there are groups inside those mystery schools in 1840 that say, you know what, we're not going to make it to the golden age because this thing is moving. They made a left turn. We have to compensate. We have to get this stuff out there. Here you go, a human society, ready or not. So.
Matt Murtaugh is asking, what is the test they use to tell if the population is ready for the secrets?
Well, I'm sure that they have seen, for example, the things that Theosophy did. Theosophy, when we walk around, Olivia, you and I were talking about this, and we see everyone walking around with a yoga mat on their back. I mean, I think Theosophy immediately, because Theosophy brought yoga to America. I think that meditation and yoga, healthy eating, positive thinking, these things come out of that tradition. And I think they're compensated for over here by intensely violent movies, over commercialized culture. And that's that very low vibration that is doing its own harvesting program. And then this other stuff is creeping in. So it's a balance for sure. But I think we're seeing it all the time. Okay.
So Titan Blooded wants to know which groups or mystery schools are associated with the Great White Brotherhood, and are any of them around now?
Well, I think that, again, we're going to use Steiner's thing. At the cradle of what was developed in Theosophy before it was dissolved, the Order of the Star in 1930, that work, the essence of that work, rolled a huge influence out. Now, it seems like there was a wing of time there, which was, the incredible work of the Theosophical Society, Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, the Gurdjieff work. These are all incredibly high transmissions of deep knowledge from mystery schools. Now, I think what has to happen, though, is the culture needs to digest it. And so that period was allowed. And then you look over 100 years and you say, oh, a lot of the groups degenerated. If you look at, and I mentioned Alice Bailey, but I Am movements, there's a lot of spin-offs that happened that I think, and it's not to so much, but we can see what happens is, it's not that I want to be the judge of all those groups and say they didn't do well, or like Elizabeth Clare Prophet, but I think there's a different essence. There's a different thrust to those groups. And I think the commercialism crept in a lot too. The early groups had their own problems, There are a lot of people who say that the Steiner stuff didn't hit its stride the way that it should. That's a lot of information that he gave out. But at its core, if you look at Besant, if you look at Steiner, if you look at Blavatsky, and if you look at the Casey work, it's an incredible foundation that has not been followed up on. We have not had that. And instead, look at our own commercial, alternative, independent community. We get a lot of junk from like Gaia and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that has nothing to do with the incredible advances that these people had made, these groups had made. So we need to understand, in order to move forward, the impact that these great groups made.
I'd like to bring up here the 90s and how there seemed to be an opening up, at least in America, well, actually really all over the world, because when we had the year 2000 celebrations,
Yes.
the Millennium celebrations. I mean, they had people were reading New Agey books, and they, soccer moms, and everybody was open. And then 9/11 happened.
Yes.
And everybody went into their root chakra, and it was all about survival. And so all of our opening and our blossoming spiritually shut down in fear. And we've never really come back from that.
Wow. Well, you're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, the thrust of it is it locks you down in fear.
Mm-hmm.
How can you explore your consciousness when you are overwhelmed by ideas of this enemy group bombing the country? And then you look at the events of 9/11 and you realize, as a journalist, I can look at it and say that it doesn't add up. Then what? So it does. It throws us into a total different state. And I think that there's an opportunity here in this period, I'd say here, this kind of 2020 avenue, where we can pick up some of the threads that these great groups, mystery schools, have given us. I don't think that in the grand scheme of things, I don't know if the response has been worthy of the effort on the other side. Let's put it that way.
Well, the powers that be are making us more violent, more aggressive, more competitive with one another. All of the TV shows are all competitions. So there seems to be an influence that is keeping us, again, in our lower chakras. And that as long as I ask myself all the time, what's the antidote to that? And I think it has to be meditation, and sort of that what we choose to focus our consciousness on. So I don't know if it's going to be a matter of a collective, we need to have sort of a 100th monkey situation, where we start to, go up the chakras again, and we start to open up again and trust one another again, and live with more open hearts, be more compassionate, be more generous. And then maybe we can start applying some of the lessons the Ascended Masters have given us.
I agree with you. I totally agree with that. The thing that's interesting about it is everything that we do makes a ripple everywhere else, right? This is something I think that we kind of fundamentally understand. So when we do our work, when we're approaching the Deep Steganography X program, when we're approaching these mystery schools and asking for their answers and the things that they came up with and the experiences they had working with this, we're getting much closer than if we're obsessed with some political figure and we're, going into the 2 minutes hate routine from 1984, where, somebody's being touted out there for us to hate. And we think, hey, we hate their politics, or we hate the corruption, and hate, and then nothing happens. It's because I think fundamentally, and this happens in journalism a lot, journalism is all about electing things to be dehumanized. And a lot of journalism that we see, mainstream journalism, does this. And we see it now, of course, in the independent circles. What needs to happen is, instead of getting all worked up, and instead of thinking that that's being awake, that we become awake by understanding these higher principles from an objective point of view, and even some of the political interplay and dialogue. And, there are times to get a hot head about different types of situations that happen politically. Don't get me wrong. I don't think, this is not saying that we should stand down politically at all. What I'm saying is, I think the way to get a better picture of where we are in dealing with things like politics in journalism, in the media, in the kind of commercialist culture that we're in the culture itself, is to come from an objective place in the first place. One of the things that's great about the Gurdjieff work is it's all about being careful about what you identify with. So if we're identifying with people who are telling us, hey, wake up and be angry, then it might feel good and it might have a certain attraction to do that. But in essence, what it's doing is completely distorting your senses. So no, we have to come from a centered place in dealing with this. And I think that that's true in any kind of endeavor, especially journalism.
Bill Ferry says, we have to be ready spiritually. Casey said, when the fifth root race is appearing.
Now, it's fascinating because one of the things I'm going to address is the root race question, Bill, and I appreciate that. But you're absolutely right. And of course, the Theosophists call it the sixth root race. So you're going to have to clear up that discrepancy between the Western version through Casey and the Theosophical version. But one of the things that was said was that that group that's coming in, which is the next root race, has a more sensitive nervous system because they are more super sensitive to the higher kind of ethereal planes, and that they're more in tune with kind of like what we had as physical bodies in Atlantis, according to this kind of tradition. So that's an excellent point, actually. Okay, what else you got?
David Donaway said, can masters project both forwards and backwards in time, according to Steiner?
Well, certainly when you look at the Steiner work, everything is about perception. So he's saying when you go back and you learn the technique through anthroposophy and you look at something like Atlantis, you enter into the experience. So you start to get a sense of what it was all about. Now, there's a lot of questions in there about what's predestined. There's a lot of questions in there about what can be done in the past and all the rest of it. But I would say that it's not definitive on Steiner's side, saying that you can go back in time. But he does say that you can enter into this place. Now, as far as what the masters can do, what's wonderful is Annie Besant's version of what a master was pretty straight ahead. Somebody who basically has evolved faster and has kind of thrown off the physical demands for the spiritual demands and gotten kind of, ahead in the evolutionary track spiritually and come back to help everyone else do the same thing. That's kind of the most basic understanding. But what happens with that is we can see the challenges and what they are. And this is talked about a lot in the Casey work, which is attunement and service. So you have attunement by meditation. You have attunement through the various interactions that you have with the mystery school information. But then that's one side of it. If that's not fulfilled in service, then it kind of shoots back on itself. We have a kind of a problem like that in early Theosophy after Blavatsky died. There's a lot of infighting. They have all the information, but the idea of service kind of went out of it among a lot of the members. And Besant became all about, let's do service of political movements. Let's free India and all this stuff. So she understood that it becomes like an overboiling pot if it's not treated correctly. So you get the inspiration, you get the download in a sense, and then you have to do something with it, which is service, which isn't always glamorous. I remember one of the things that Hewlin Casey had his students do was push these seniors in wheelchairs along Virginia Beach to put them in the right state for doing their meditation search for God groups. Think of how different that is from the spiritual, Tony Robbins type approach that you see a lot of these spiritual groups, which is like, be the best that you can be, build your brand, make your kind of money now. And there's nothing wrong with making money or having a brand, but it's where the emphasis lies. When you get into mystery school stuff, you have to be serious. You can't just have it out there. You have to be serious about doing it. But it's interesting, I think, as an impulse across the culture in any case. Okay, what else you got?
Okay.
We'll take two more questions.
Okay, RG, what about the S in Harry S. Truman?
Excellent catch. Well, what's very odd is, as I understand it, I have two good sources on this now, so I'm looking for a third one. But as it stands, Harry Truman was always called Harry Truman. And then when he got in office, he started calling himself Harry S. Truman. And they asked him, in the media, they would say, well, what does the S stand for? And he says the S stands for nothing. But in fact, when he became a 33rd degree Mason while president in 1945, in October, after he had dropped the atomic bomb, people around there, around the Truman administration, said that the S was for Solomon, which, Masonry goes back to building Solomon's Temple, and that he had achieved this incredible level. So it's Harry Solomon Truman. So that's what the S stands for. It's a Mason reference.
I love this question. I'm sorry, it's David Donaway's night. Is civilization a system of karma control?
Well, in the esoteric tradition, you have the law of karma and the law of grace. Okay. In the law of grace, you pass away from your karma. So if you've set up karma by doing certain things, you can enter into the law of grace and overcome the law of karma. If you're just caught in the wheel of karma, then that civilization is a way of working it out. But let's say in general, there's a better way to go, which is to fall under the law of grace. That's the esoteric tradition. So I think when we think about karma, it's not a situation that can't be remedied. Let's put it that way.
Okay, let's do two more.
Okay.
No name. Have you been able to find out where the Keeley technology sent to Annie Besant is located now?
No. What is interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because what I did find in the Keeley information, which is over here, it's pretty fascinating. Not only did they get the information from Keeley, and I think that Besant did the right thing, I also happen to think that holding it as a kind of vouchsafing it for a future when we could use it, I happen to think that part of it became available through the Varians and part of it became available through Wallace. That much I will say. But I don't think the thrust of what Keeley was doing is available even now. We still haven't got it. In terms of where they kept it, I think that they had ways and means for doing this, and I think over time they figured out a good channel for where to keep it. It may even be in India.
Nicholas wants to know what books are on your keyboard, but of course it's not a keyboard anymore. It's just a table.
Well, let's take a look, shall we? You've got, that's Cosmic Memory by Rudolf Steiner. There's a great book, actually, I'm reading, which is Russell Varian and Sig Varian's biographies written by Dorothy Varian, and it's called The Pilot and the Inventor. And I was lucky to track it down. Actually, there are some copies of it, but this was something kind of special. Let's see, Legends of Atlantis and Lost in Lemuria, which is a Scott Elliott book, which is a theosophical attempt at the Atlantis trip. But this one, although Steiner, who really checked them out and said this is what they got right, this is what they got wrong, this one he actually is okay on. He actually recommends it, some of the stuff that's in there. Another Steiner book, Outline of Occult Science there. And you've got Emma Britton's biography, which I highly recommend everyone. Remember, Emma Britton brought us the Orphic Circle and all that understanding about how these prime ministers and high English people used her from the ages of about 11 to 14 as a somnambulist trance channel to get state secrets and also understand the nature of reality, and had this incredible impact on her. But she came here to Boston and set up shop as a spiritual teacher, and just, it's an incredible journey.
Michael Wisdom wants to know, who did these societies believe Jesus was? Did they believe in the divine consciousness?
By the way, that's Emma Britton. When after the Orphic Circle, she became a theater actress, dancer. Jesus, yeah. Well, Jesus is considered by the Steiner people, the Christ impulse is the movement of evolution in Western esoteric tradition. So the anthroposophical movement is very Christian based, but it's esoteric Christianity. I think that the Gurdjieff movement is also esoteric Christianity. Theosophy is a little bit different in the sense that it had a lot of Christian roots, and the Halcyon Temple certainly has a lot of Christian imagery. But Theosophy got very influenced by Buddhism and Eastern initiators and things of this nature, and there's a whole story behind that. But basically, the upshot is, in Steiner's worldview, it's the Western initiators that need to take us into the next step. The Eastern initiators set us up to have this next step, but the Eastern initiators aren't the impulse for us to take the next step now. That's basically how they see it. So that Christian mystery tradition is where the next step takes us.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
This is my question.
Okay, this is the last question.
So the powers that be. All right, let's take a look at sort of They Live as a metaphor. The movie
They Live, the movie, yeah. Roddy Piper.
Yeah, so let's say that sort of elite alien class.
Okay.
They're aware of reincarnation. And why would anyone who is aware of the secrets, these great secrets, want to be bound to the misery of the earth plane, the suffering here, even if you're wealthy and powerful? It's a pretty miserable life compared to the expansiveness of,
I see where you're coming from.
Okay.
What I would say is, remember, it's something that's crucial to keep in mind that we ended the last episode with, and we'll end this one with it too, just for the hell of it, that the, might as well show that shut up Pine Gap while I'm at it. Keep that in mind for the next episode. The harmonic reality is to bind everything to Earth. And they want to create that eighth sphere to bind the evolution of the culture of humanity to Earth and not have it move on to its impulse, which takes us to Jupiter and the next stages. That's the esoteric backdrop of anthroposophy around Ahriman. So Ahriman is kind of a crucial consideration when you're talking about this, because Ahriman is, there's a lot of illusion with Ahriman. So these people who are thinking, I'm doing everything, I'll be master of the universe kind of thing, they're moving into this eighth sphere of thinking. They're working with a kind of mystery school knowledge around the eighth sphere, and they're moving into this illusion that they can, what is it that they say in these traditions? That they can rise up some other way as opposed to spiritual evolution. That's what merging with the technology and the transhumanist push is all about. And trust me, over the course of these next 10 episodes, transhumanism is going to come right into the spotlight. But I want to say, and I haven't said it during the whole show, please do go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. That's the way that we stay in touch. And this is the important thing that we need to do. Because social media is touch and go, as we know, but this way we'll always be in touch with each other. Make sure you do it. Also, get behind the show if you're there. Subscribe to what we're doing. Promote the work as best you can, and definitely share the insights that you've had on the X series. We will be back next week. We're going to do a recorded show of a new interview with Catherine Austin Fitz on Friday. And so we won't be here live next Friday, but we'll be live a week from Monday on Memorial Day. Are you ready, Olivia?
I am. I'm excited for it.
From 4 to 7, and this is a breakthrough episode coming up, 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday. Do you want to check the date on that? It's a week from Monday.
Okay. I don't know how to do that on the computer.
Oh, yes. Yeah, on that one, I know. Here. We're going to do it.
Something like the 28th or something?
No, it is not the 28th. It's the 28th.
Okay.
So on Monday, the 28th, from 4 to 7, it'll be quite the enterprise for our next episode. Next Friday, Catherine Austin Fitz. And all summer, the rest of the X series, which I guarantee you is going to go further and deeper. And really, we've laid a good foundation, I think, in the first 10 episodes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I've had a great time tonight. Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you. And everybody, I just want to let you know that DJ reads all of your questions that were not asked. I keep them in a little note, and he does review them for future reference.
Absolutely. And, thank you for all the emails, all the incredible encouragement around the X series. We really appreciate it. We're going where no one has gone before. And the truth is that the level and the thrust of the information coming in is kind of self-perpetuating at this point. There's a lot of information that we have not even touched. I would say we're barely into about 5% of what we're going to present. So it is great to have everyone here. I should do a few shout outs. Rika, of course, is out there. I know I saw her earlier in Ice Angel. Thank you. Really appreciate you showing up. And I do think that we've had a great crowd tonight. Lots of fantastic questions. No name, excellent. And really terrific to see you. Next week, Catherine Austin Fitz, and on Friday in a recorded show. And we will see you live again a week from Monday at 4 p.m. though, Eastern. So right there in the heart. Hopefully a lot of our European visitors, that's Memorial Day here. It's a holiday. But for our European viewers and for people not in the US, that's not a holiday for you guys. So it's 4 p.m. Eastern. Figure that out in your clocks, and hopefully we'll see you there.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks so much. What's on your mind tonight?
Oh, it's going to be pizza again.
Pizza. I love it. Now we're talking. Well, that makes a Friday night.
And root beer with tequila.
Wow. This only gets better. I can't wait to hear what the rest of the menu has. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later.
Good night.